Hello class, this is Dr. Anderson and we will be discussing pain. Here are our learning objectives. What is the function of pain? What causes pain? And what are the properties of nociceptors? We want to compare and contrast fast and slow pain in terms of pathway, speed of transmission, how it's interpreted in the central nervous system. If the somatosensory cortex were missing or damaged, could a person still sense pain? The answer is yes. It has to do with the thalamus, and we'll get to that later in the lecture. Transduction, transmission, perception, and modulation are very important in terms of thinking about what happens with pain and how you treat pain with drugs. And we want to talk about endogenous opioids in pain modulation. Referred pain is a kind of acute pain where we're confused about where the pain's coming from. There are reasons for that. And then we're going to end our discussion talking about chronic pain, introducing some terminology that'll be helpful to you in the clinical arena. So pain is an important clinical application of sensory physiology. People in pain is a huge public health issue. It's hard to study because of translation between animal models and humans. We do a lot of work on animals, but you can't just go in and say, good morning, Mr. Rabbit, in terms of, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your pain today? We can't do that kind of thing. So, so translation is difficult, though animals have some of the same pathways we do in terms of pain processing. Pain, of course, has, psychosocial impact. What's your family support? How are you feeling? Are you depressed? Are you lonely? That's going to make pain worse. Can you move around? You're not moving around because you're hurt, but because you aren't moving around, that makes you hurt worse. So pain is carried in the anterior lateral nociceptive pathway. That's the spinothalamic tract. So remember, out here we've got some kind of stimulus, and it could be intense heat or some kind of mechanical, like pinching or that kind of thing, or could be chemical, and that activates nociceptors, goes into the spinal cord, synapses right away, crosses, so we have contralateral representation, so rises on the on the contralateral side of the spinal cord, goes to the thalamus, and then is projected to the somatosensory cortex to be interpreted, but there are collaterals that go in the brainstem, into the limbic system, and all that sort of thing for additional processing. So we have fast pain and we have slow pain. Fast pain is associated with mechanical or temperature stimuli. You pinch your finger, or you touch a hot stove. Really intense, sharp, electric, intense pain. It's called fast because it uses myelinated fibers. They're not the largest of the fibers, but they are myelinated. The transmission velocity is 5 to 30 meters per second. That's not nearly as fast as the discriminating pathway, but still pretty fast. This is called the neospinothalamic, new spinothalamic, because in terms of evolution, this is a relatively new pathway. Not all animals have this kind of pathway. Very, very well localized, and the neurotransmitter in the spinal cord is glutamate. Slow pathways are just that, they're slow. Polymodal, what does that mean? That means nociceptors can respond to a variety of stimuli, and it usually are those that indicate tissue destruction. So fast pain, you burn, you touch a hot stove, you jerk your hand away. If there's no tissue damage, the pain's over with. But if you did burn your finger, then the tissue destruction gives you slow pain. It's slow because it goes along C fibers. Remember, those are small and unmyelinated, so the transmission velocity is slow, 0.5 to 2 meters per second. This is older in terms of evolution. We share this pathway with our animal friends. So it's the paleospinothalamic, the old spinothalamic. It's harder to localize. You know it hurts, but you're not exactly sure where. And substance P is the neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. Spinal cord is actually pretty complicated here. I just want you to be aware, so we have our our A delta or our C fiber. It does synapse right away, but there are some differences. So notice there are a number of synapses. So the dorsal horn is divided up into a bunch of layers, and the important layers are layers 2, 3, and 4, which together are the substantia gelatinosa. And so there's quite a bit of synapsing and collaterals going on in this layer, and there's some differences between the two pathways. The A delta fibers are going to be very important for reflexes. You touch the hot stove, so you set off a reflex and you jerk your arm away. So the fast pain are very important for reflexes and that sort of thing. C fibers are telling you there's tissue destruction and you need to go crawl off somewhere and take care of yourself. It's also very nicely how this diagram shows the parallel pathways that are separate pathways for the neo-spinothalamic and the paleospinothalamic tract. There are collaterals in both pathways that take us to the reticular activating center. So this system is a group of nuclei in the brainstem, and some of these pathways go down for motor activity, but the pathways that go up are about orientation and awareness. Oh my gosh, I just burned my finger. Or, oh my gosh, I sprained my ankle and it's throbbing and I just can't get to sleep. So you're aware of it. It's going to interfere with your sleep. It's going to be hard to concentrate on other things because pain is being routed through this reticular activating system. There are separate nuclei for fast pain and slow pain. And in terms of pain, the thalamus does some limited processing. So if you had a person in intensive care and they had a lot of brain damage, but they still had a thalamus, they could still feel some pain. It's going to be really hard to assess. They're not localizing the pain, they're not providing a context for it, but you would think, well, this person doesn't have a cortex. Why would they need pain medication? You know, and this is a big can of worms. You would say, well, why are we keeping this person alive when the cortex and their personality is where this person is? These are very complicated issues, folks. However, they would be, they would be doing interesting motor behavior. It'd be hard to know, is this, is this decerebrate activity? Is this pain? Surely you'd be able to see some heart rate effects, but just because somebody doesn't have a cortex doesn't mean they can't feel pain. It's just very crude, and they wouldn't be able to localize it or that sort of thing, but it would still hurt them. We also have antinociceptive, so the PAG, periaqueductal gray matter. So this is the midbrain. Here is an interesting structure. That's the red nucleus. We'll talk about that when we talk about motor activity. This is the substantia nigra. We'll talk about this in motor when we talk about Parkinson's. This is a nucleus that then goes to the eye, oculomotor nerve, all right? This is an area called the tectum. When you stimulate the tectum, you feel intense pain. But then this area, the periaqueductal gray matter, it's the gray matter around the aqueduct. This is an interesting area. When you stimulate it, people feel analgesia. They feel touch and all this other stuff, but they don't feel pain. And If you do binding studies for opioid receptors, there's a bunch of opioid receptors in this area. So it's called the brain's analgesia center. So we have anti-nociceptive pathways. So the periaqueductal gray matter releases endorphin, responds to endorphins. Then we have a serotonergic pathway that goes to the raphe nucleus. Then we have pathways that go down further. And notice this is an axo-axonal synapse. So you have presynaptic inhibition of pain information coming in. If we reduce neurotransmitter release at this synapse, then there'll be less transmission up to the brain. So it's called an anti-nociceptive pathway. So it's also called modulation. So we have a sensory neuron coming in, and it could be releasing glutamate or it could be releasing substance P. We have a downward pathway releasing an opioid which binds to receptors. It's going to decrease calcium influx into this synaptic, this axonal terminus. We have less neurotransmitter release, and therefore we inhibit pain transmission up the spinal cord. Here's another picture showing you a lot more detail. So here's your nociceptor. There's your axon terminus. We're releasing, in this case, substance P. Opioids would bind to receptors. These are G-cup protein receptors. They're going to affect calcium in this area, and less calcium, you're going to have less exocytosis of neurotransmitter. So that opioid could come from, say, enkephalin, from this particular anti-nociceptive axo-axonal synapse, or we can add exogenous opioid from the outside. We can give somebody morphine, and that also can use the anti-nociceptive pathway. Somatic stimulation seems to relieve pain. So rubbing the area, giving a massage, using acupuncture or those little TENS devices. Why does that work? I don't know. So there are a couple of things that there's lateral inhibition, that when you activate touch pathways, they laterally inhibit pain pathways. And there's a theory that's been around for ages and ages and ages called gate theory. And gate theory says that there's a limited amount of information, sensory information, that can come into the brain, and when you're sending touch information, it prevents pain information from coming in. That, it's all very theoretical. I just would like you to be aware of it as opposed to knowing all the mechanisms, because nobody knows all the mechanisms. So, I talked a couple of weeks ago about frameworks and theories and those sorts of things, and how they're just ways to see what your variables are and what the relationship between your variables are and what your assumptions are. So transduction is a process that happens at the receptor. It's converting a chemical or noxious stimulus into an electrical signal. If we reach threshold at the trigger zone, then we have transmission, meaning action potentials traveling towards the central nervous system. That information goes up to the spinal cord, and we sense it, and we provide a context for it, which is interpretation and perception. And then we can activate modulation pathways or anti-nociceptive pathways that go down and block neurotransmitter release in the spinal cord so that we minimize transmission. So transduction at the receptor, transmission through the axons, perception in the brain, modulation through downward anti-nociceptive pathways. So you can expand on this framework by thinking about how things interact with things. So transduction happens at the receptor. Why do we put an ice pack on things? Why do we give people NSAIDs? Well, or like ibuprofen. Well, ibuprofen is going to block the production of prostaglandins. That's going to decrease transduction of pain. You put ice on something. that interacts with transduction and certainly transmission of pain perception. Transmission. This is affected by local anesthetics. You give somebody Novocaine or bupivacaine or whatever, you're blocking voltage-gated sodium channels. You can't transmit action potentials along this pathway. That goes up to the brain. When you give spinal anesthesia or general anesthesia, you're affecting transmission and perception in the brain. Then, when you give opioids of all sorts, you are affecting modulation. Opioids probably work at all the levels, and certainly I think we had a conversation about ketamine. Ketamine may be working at all these levels. And so this is a nice framework to not only think about the physiology, but to think about pharmacotherapeutics. Referred pain is an interesting kind of acute pain. So fast pain and slow pain are acute pain. Referred pain happens because we get mixed up about our perception of pain. Our whole life, if we did too many push-ups or we bruised our arm, we activated nociceptors that went up and told us that our left arm was hurting. And then one day we have a heart attack, and visceral receptors synapse on the same secondary neuron. It goes up to the brain along that same old pathway, and your brain says, oh, my arm hurts. Only it's not coming from your arm, it's coming from your heart. But your interpretation has been accustomed to receiving signals from the arm. So we interpret it as a somatic sensation, as something visceral. And so, I thought I had a picture here. So, for example, if somebody's having kidney problems, they're going to feel it in their lower back. Somebody's having, like an ovarian cyst, a person might feel pain going down their legs. It's you wouldn't necessarily know. You'd go into the doctor and say, I feel pain in my jaw, I feel pain in my arm, I feel pain in my lower back. Well, you have to think about, well, maybe that's actually a referred pain from a visceral source, and that's how the patient is interpreting that. Okay, finally, chronic pain. Chronic pain, what we've talked about so far is acute pain. You stub your toe, you sprain your ankle, you burn your hand, whatever. But if you still are having pain after 6 months and you're having difficulty managing it, and it's interfering with your sleep and your ability to do things, this is chronic pain. And you may do an x-ray and say, well, there's nothing there. That bone is healed. That area is fixed. There's nothing here on the x-ray that would tell me why this patient is still having pain. Well, it's entirely possible that there have been some synaptic changes in the spinal cord, and there have been new pathways and new neurotransmitters and new physiology such that the pain is being created by the nervous system. It's not out in the periphery. It's being produced by the nervous system, and the person does indeed feel it. So it's very important to manage pain acutely. People want to say, oh, I don't want those pain meds because I'm going to get addicted. Well, if you manage pain better in the acute level, you are going to avoid chronic pain later. Now, that's not to say, hey, let's give everybody morphine, because we have an opioid crisis in this country. So, assessment is critical. Patient education is critical. People need the medications they need, and they need to take them on regular schedules. They shouldn't wait until they're in such pain they can't stand it. But, if ibuprofen and ice does it, you should use that and not use an opioid. That's a very complicated issue. I can't begin to deal with it on this presentation, and maybe we could discuss some of that in class. So here's some things you think about with chronic pain. Hyperalgesia. So typically, if you caused a pain stimulus, a little pin prick, you'd feel a little bit of pain, but now it just is on a scale of 10. So it's an exaggerated pain response. Allodynia is feeling pain to something that's not noxious. So a touch response. So you have to think about this. You know, we think about hugging people and rubbing their shoulders and patting them on the back. Oh my goodness, if you're having trouble with allodynia, you don't want people to touch you. Yes, they want to be comforted. Yes, they want care and nursing care, but don't touch them. and you need to think about that. People may not welcome a touch if it ends up causing them pain. Causalgia is a burning pain, typically because of nerve damage, and you never know when those nerves are going to heal. I sprained my ankle, and I know I damaged some nerves. I had burning pain on the top of my foot. There were some times I just couldn't sleep at night unless I had an ice pack on my foot. And my sprained ankle had long been healed, but the causalgia went on for a long, long time. Hyperesthesia. That's like pinpricks and pins and needles and that fuzzy feeling. Those are unpleasant experiences. Maybe because a nerve has been compressed and the sensations have been altered. Neuropathic pain, again, no tissue damage. The tissue damage has been healed, but the person is feeling pain because of synaptic changes happening in the central nervous system. Alrighty, so we're down to the home stretch. We have finished pain. Think about your questions. Think about those learning objectives. And then our last section will be on temperature. Thanks very much. I'll talk to you next time.